And so I made a video recently about a new piece of muscle growth research, and one area within that study was set endpoints, aka training to failure. And I read through so many comments and there was so much great discussion and so many interesting ideas in relation to that. And so what I wanted to do is to make an isolated video on failure training and to give information from the evidence base that I didn't have time to talk about before. And so if you train to failure or not is your individual decision. I cannot tell you that through YouTube, and of course you have flexibility with the concept. For example, if you do choose to use failure training, you don't have to use it on every set of an exercise. You may, for example, just use it on the last set of an exercise. You don't have to use it on every exercise in a session. You may only choose to go to failure on single joint or machine-based exercises or using a certain piece of equipment. It really depends on your needs. And so when I hear this question, should you train to failure or not, I don't think of it as such a fixed proposition, such a set ideology of yes or no. I think it's better to rephrase the question of how much failure training should you include in your sessions. And this piece of research was authored by many top researchers in the field such as Helms, Phillips, Grgic, Steele, Schoenfeld and others, which has 248 references in it. And remember that exercise science, and this video of course, is a guideline for you. Discard what doesn't fit you, take on board which may be useful to you, and that in my opinion is how videos should be presented on YouTube. So firstly, let's define failure, which in itself importantly is a debated term. Finally, the term momentary failure lacks a consensus definition. Though we have noted the definitions of Steele above, some research considers failure as the point where technique breaks down in an effort to complete a lift. Others define it as the point where an individual volitionally feels they cannot perform another repetition, and yet others characterize it as the inability to physically overcome the demands of the load, thus causing an involuntary end to the set. And of course, the problem with these different definitions is difficult to draw strong conclusions from research investigating the effect of set endpoint on muscle hypertrophy. And so instantly, that is an important limitation of failure training research that you can be aware of. You could call it a failure. That was all right, shut up. But here is a decent definition from Samson and Groeller that I'd like to project to you. Training to failure is defined as the point where the activated muscles are incapable of completing another complete repetition without assistance. The literature remains somewhat unclear as to whether training to muscular failure is obligatory to maximize increases in muscle mass. A meta-analysis by Grgic et al. Showed no hypertrophic benefit, I know I'm saying his name wrong, I apologize, to failure training when pooling all studies meeting inclusion criteria. I would say that training to failure is not obligatory, but it is perhaps a tool that you may use. That's a good way to look at it. And so here are some ideas I want to throw in your face respectfully. Load. Load is central, of course, to most exercise considerations. If you're using lower reps and a heavier weight for your training, then failure training is most likely not going to be an absolute priority for you. You are already stressing the muscle, creating adaptations with your high intensity, your high load, without the need to go to mechanical failure. Focusing on quality reps and overcoming that load by producing force with the activation of motor units and the recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers and all that good stuff is sufficient for muscle growth. And not going to failure may also help you with your recovery between sessions. However, with lower loads and a lighter weight, perhaps failure training becomes more of a consideration. This theory is based on the premise that training closer to the set endpoint is necessary when using lower loads to recruit high threshold motor units associated with type 2 muscle fibers. Okay, those hard to reach type 2 muscle fibers, those powerful fibers, I have videos breaking that down, which have been suggested to have the greatest hypertrophic potential. But let's critique that by looking at the evidence base. Research on the topic remains scant. How dare you? But of course, remember that research is just a guideline, and despite the fact that we do need more research into the area of lower loads and failure, of course you can use failure training if you are using a lighter weight. And this can also relate to the practical realities of training that you perhaps don't see in the textbook. For example, some of you may only have lighter weights. Maybe you're training at home, for example. Therefore, you may not have access to heavier weight, and maybe you need to go to failure as a tool to overload the muscle. Or you may want to use advanced methods such as drop sets or supersets or manipulating your rest time and all those different types of things. And so when we think of any issue, you have to think of the practical realities. Next, safety. And especially when using a loaded bar, common sense needs to come into play. When you think about those multi-joint major compound lifts with barbells, for example, there's so many technical aspects that goes into a lift. It may be beneficial for people to not go to the point of failure where the mechanics of movement are compromised. And so we have machines where, for example, they help to stabilize your core, which may be more suitable for failure training for people. And then we have single joint movements such as bicep curls, which are far less complex than multi-joint movements. Again, therefore, from a safety point of view, they may be more suitable to train to failure. Furthermore, with compound free weight movements such as the barbell bench press, back squat, and step-up exercises, safety precautions become particularly important when training to failure due to the position of the load and the potential loss of balance with fatigue. Next factor, recovery. And so training to failure, of course, can mean that more recovery time is needed between sessions. For example, we have Navarro et al., who looked at the bench press and they saw that performance was affected for 48 hours. Granted, that had a very small sample size, but when we look at the evidence base, we're looking around 24 to 48 hours recovery time. And so a practical application for you. If you are going to hit a muscle group or movement pattern multiple times per week, then training to failure may not be advised because you would need more recovery time, and that may affect your ability to hit that muscle group many times a week with effective, efficient workouts. And therefore, you may not be allowing enough recovery time in that high frequency model. And if you are hitting the same muscle groups or movements several times a week, then you're probably challenging the muscle enough anyway, and you don't really need to go to failure. And so these are the sorts of applications that you can start to consider, start to play around with in your mind. The type of exercise is another important consideration when deciding set endpoint prescriptions. For example, compound free weight movements such as deadlifts and bent rows are more technically demanding and engage more total muscle mass than single joint exercises, which may negatively influence recovery. Persistent long-term use of failure training with these types of exercises may thus predispose individuals to overtraining. Alternatively, single joint exercises and many machine-based movements tend to be less taxing, thus individuals conceivably can tolerate higher intensities of effort with their use. The validity of this hypothesis and how it might influence adaptations remains uncertain. Next, age and training experience. For older people, training to failure is perhaps not the best idea when we think about recovery and safety and those types of issues. And again, beginners who are learning movements in the gym, again, performing them to failure, not the best idea. However, for more intermediate to advanced lifters who are competent with the movements, with the technical aspects of the lifts, who are comfortable and experienced under load, for example, then training to failure may become more suitable. Age should also be considered when prescribing set endpoints. Evidence indicates that recovery capacity tends to decline with advancing age, necessitating a longer recuperative period after a resistance training bout. Given that failure training negatively impacts recovery, its implementation in training programs conceivably could have a greater detrimental effect on older athletes. However, the effects of failure training in this population lacks direct study, limiting the ability to draw objective conclusions on the topic. But to end, and we're almost there, a really interesting discussion into the application of failure training. And as always, it is intended to project it to this community for your ideas because, of course, you add value to the topic with your input. Proximity to failure has primarily been considered in a binary fashion, to failure or not to failure. As such, it is unclear what the exact nature of the dose-response relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophic adaptation is. It seems unlikely to be a purely linear function, nor indeed a threshold-based step function. Novice lifters can achieve robust gains in muscle mass without training at a close proximity to failure. As an individual gains training experience, the need to increase intensity of effort appears to become increasingly important. Although speculative, highly trained lifters, for example, bodybuilders, may benefit from taking some sets to momentary muscular failure. In such cases, its use should be employed somewhat conservatively, perhaps limiting application to the last set of a given exercise. Moreover, confining the use of failure training primarily to single joint movements and machine-based exercises may help to manage the stimulus-fatigue ratio and thus reduce potential negative consequences on recuperation. I think that's a great paragraph. That's a very key takeaway that I hope will help people. Periodizing failure training may be a viable option, whereby very high levels of effort are employed liberally prior to a peaking phase and then followed by a tapering phase involving reduced levels of effort. And so that's a lot of information. I hope it created confusion for you. Now, I hope it just gave you lots of ideas that you can think critically about. But importantly, don't suffer from paralysis by analysis. And as always, I wish you the best in your fitness journey. I'm James Lincoln. My mouth is dry. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.